Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Jacobs. I'm the founder and CEO of panOpen, which is the host of this webinar series. And we are a courseware company focused on delivering open educational resources, providing the tools, support, infrastructure, technology for faculty and institutions to adopt openly licensed content. So a year ago, we had only a dim awareness of a viral threat from a distant land. By spring, it was already a cliche that our world had changed forever, that standard practice for our email salutations would include phrases like, "Stay safe," "I hope you're managing okay," "Strange times." To be sure, the pandemic and its related economic and political crises has at once accelerated and slowed processes that were long underway. Nowhere is this more evident, more apparent than in higher education, and especially among those institutions that serve economically disadvantaged communities and those of color. These communities have been especially hard hit, as they are also often frontline workers and people who were already struggling before our world had changed. Higher education is usually countercyclical to unemployment and recessions. Not this time, and not especially for these communities. In this context, we've organized a webinar series, Teaching in a Time of Uncertainty, and asked faculty authors with whom we're working to address the question of what it means to teach their discipline in this time of uncertainty. If we think of the triple crises as health, economic, and political, how do they affect the way we introduce students to a particular field of study? How does the content or the content emphasis change? Does the form of teaching change if instruction is blended or fully remote? So joining me today are Professors Terry Gilmour and Andy Tias. Terry is a professor of political science at Midland College, received her PhD in political science from Texas Tech. She's also the director of the honors program at the college and serves as the advisor for Phi Theta Kappa, the International Honor Society for Community College Students. Currently, she serves as chair of the political science education section of APSA, the American Political Science Association. She's also served on the executive board of the Southwest Political Science Association. Through the years, she has presented numerous papers in the field of teaching and learning. At Midland College, she has served as the president of the Faculty Senate, and she and her husband have established a fund to help faculty attend professional development opportunities. She received the Teaching Excellence Award, the highest award given by the college, and has been selected by students as Teacher of the Year 3 times. Andy Tias is professor of government at Houston Community College. A native of Houston, he graduated from the University of Texas and earned an MPA at LBJ School of Public Affairs. He worked as a legislative aide and a committee clerk in the Texas Senate and in the House, and for the Congressional Liaison Office of the US EPA in Washington. Together, both Terry and Andy are, with other faculty at Houston Community College, Alvin College, and elsewhere, are working with us to put together an exciting new OER-based courseware on Texas government, and we'll be releasing that next month. Very excited about that project. Next week, we'll hold the second of this government teaching series, February 3rd at noon Central Time, with 2 other authors of this Texas Government OER project, HCC professors Mark Shoemaker and Alvin College professor Kevin Jeffries. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to first Terry and then Andy for their perspectives on what it means to teach American and a good measure of Texas government in a time of uncertainty. So with that in mind, I turn now to Terry. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was a really nice introduction. I think that all of us were ready to say goodbye to 2020, although I'm not terribly sure that we were quite prepared for the start of 2021. I knew that as I began my classes a couple of weeks ago, that I would have to make some changes in my classroom. 2020 brought us a global pandemic. It brought us protests across the nation, and it brought us a presidential election unlike any we have seen in modern times. When I talk about some of the protest statistics, I take my information from the U.S. Crisis Monitor, which is a joint project between the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project and Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton University. So at the beginning of November of 2020, only about 6% of demonstrations were related to COVID. By the end of November of 2020, that number had risen to almost 40%. And the protests were no longer about whether we should wear masks or not wear masks, or whether we should keep our businesses open or close them, but it was much more about protections for our essential workers. As this pandemic has progressed and killed more than 400,000 Americans in this country, there is a growing concern about the strain that it is putting on our hospitals and our healthcare workers. And then we've had the beginning of the rollout of the vaccine, which has also been difficult. It's been chaotic, and I know that it's causing a lot of frustration for a number of people. When we talk about the economic impact of the pandemic, I think it'll probably be a long time before we fully understand the toll that it's going to take on our economy, as businesses had to shut down, many of them coming back in reduced capacity. Many of them will not come back at all, and it's going to be difficult for us to actually assess that big impact. When we think about public education, and when our schools had to shut down almost a year ago in March, we know that many of our students in public education literally got lost, and many of them did not come back. And certainly we're looking at the effects on higher education. Many of our colleges and universities are still completely online. Others are struggling with transition modes of delivery. We have learned more about online and synchronous and asynchronous and hybrid and high flex than probably we ever wanted to know. And probably the biggest effect is most all of us are experiencing a decline in enrollment. When you look at the social unrest in this country, certainly the shooting of Trayvon Martin in 2012 sparked the Black Lives Movement, but 2020 has been a really deadly year. And we remember a number of those names: Ahmaud Arbery in South Georgia, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, Georgia, and Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. If you look at the number of protests beginning at the start of May, going through the end of August, again, the U.S. Crisis Monitor recorded more than 10,600 demonstration events. Out of those, 80% of them were related to either COVID or the Black Lives Movement. But it's interesting to note that 95% of those were led by peaceful protest. In any event, that number is still staggering. And then we had the presidential election in November. Many of us anxiously awaited the results, particularly in Wisconsin, in Philadelphia, in Georgia, that seemed to stretch on for a very long period of time with recount after recount. And then we began to see the protest focus more on stop the steal, and of course the allegations of a fraudulent election, which spread across the nation. And of course, it culminated with the events on our nation's capital on January the 6th. So the rise of these militia groups and other armed non-state actors are posing a security threat. We watched the inauguration a week ago with more security forces than we did spectators. And then for the first time in history, President Trump was impeached for a second time, and today we await the results that will take place in the U.S. Senate. For those of us that are teaching government, and as we resume our classes in 2021, I think for many of us, there are more questions than there are answers. Our students seem to be more confused, and as educators, I really think we have our work cut out for us. I think my goals this semester are going to be a little bit different. Some of the nuts and bolts that I normally teach may get put aside a little bit. I teach at a community college in Texas where U.S. government and Texas government are required courses, but they also come to our college with only a semester of government. So we know that they come with very little knowledge. I've got 3 basic goals for this semester. And I want us to help our students have a better understanding about the importance of history. I want them to understand the value of civic education. And then the final one, I want us to teach our students to be better consumers of news. So if you look at the first one, when we're talking about historical education, for example, many of my students really believe that the racial protests began in the 1950s and in the 1960s. When we know, in fact, that is nowhere close. These protests have been going on for well over 100 years. You could look at the summer of 1919 when there were uprisings. There were racial, there were gender issues, there were issues of anti-immigration going on, and we saw a mass migration of African Americans who moved north during that time. We saw a number of those clashes that happened in small towns. The NAAC, which was formed in 1909, at that point began a national organization and a movement to create racial justice. And then, of course, during World War II and during the Depression, there were demands by African Americans to open up more defense jobs. And again, we saw African Americans begin to move north, to begin to move west, looking for jobs in the aircraft factories and in the shipyards. By 1943, there were 240 race riots that were recorded in the United States. In Los Angeles, there were threats against Mexican American men. And then, of course, we began to see the civil rights movement that did take place in the 1950s and the 1960s. But I think the point here is that we have to teach history. We have to give them the historical content in order. They can't understand the present. They can't move forward if we haven't done a good job of teaching the past. The second thing that I really want to focus on is civic education. We know that civic education will lead to civic engagement, which of course will increase the likelihood of voting. Many of us will remember, some fondly, some not so fondly, Jay Leno on his late night show would interview college students, and he would ask them the name of the president or to be able to name the 3 branches of government. And some laughed, but as a political science educator, it was incredibly sad for us. I used to give a quiz at the beginning of every semester where I would ask basic questions like, who is the president? Who is the vice president? Name one of your U.S. senators. And it was really depressing. So what I've done now is I give the same quiz, but at the end of the semester, I give it to them again. And hopefully by the end of the semester, we can find what they have learned. So the importance of civic education, in my opinion, is paramount, and we've got to return to those basics. We've got to help our students gain an understanding of the processes of government. the prevalent political ideologies, our civic and our constitutional rights, and the history and the heritage of each of those. I think that we have to help them gain an appreciation for civil discourse, for free speech, and how to engage with people who have perspectives that are different from their own. And then finally, we want to help them develop the civic agency and the confidence to vote, to volunteer, to attend public meetings, and of course, to be active in their own communities. We know that business employers today do not simply want students who can read and write and do some math. They want people who can lead teams, who can communicate effectively with their partners, to come up with new ways to solve problems and to navigate in this digital world. I think that we are especially well positioned as government professors to help them learn these skills. And again, civic education goes beyond the appreciation of those core tenets of liberty and equality and the rule of law. What we saw on January the 6th and the storming of the Capitol was not an exercise of our First Amendment right to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. It was vandalism and it was theft. And then finally, we're going to have to challenge our students to look at their own biases. Another idea, and I will tell you, I steal all of my good ideas from my colleagues, but I got this one from a colleague where I divided my students into groups of 3 or 4, socially distanced, or in breakout rooms in the online classes. And I asked them to come up with 3 ways that they were similar to each other and 1 way that they are unique. And the goal, of course, was to appreciate our similarities and to also appreciate the differences that we have. The other thing I think many of us are doing, we're beginning our classes with a current event. This morning in my 8 o'clock class, I showed the video of Amanda Gorman, the poet laureate who gave her poem at the inauguration. And then I asked them after it was over to reflect on what did they see, what did they think, and what did they wonder about? So opening up these lines of communication. And then finally, I think it's imperative that we teach our students to be good consumers of information. The misinformation or the unintentionally misleading people or the disinformation intentionally misleading people, primarily on social media, has become overwhelming. And it's disappointing that even people my age, people who have an education, are willing to believe what they have read without checking their sources. So I think we're going to have to take time in the classroom to teach our students how to fact check and to make sure that information before they pass it on is in fact factual. And this may in fact be the most important challenge that we have in 2021. So before I close, I just have a couple of quotes that I would like to share with you. The first one from Horace Mann, of course, the father of American education, who said, "It may be an easy thing to make a republic, but it is a very laborious thing to make republicans. And woe to the republic that rests upon no better foundations than ignorance, selfishness, and passion." And then the next one from our Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, reiterating the importance of civic education, like all education, is a continuing enterprise and conversation. Each generation has an obligation to pass on to the next, not a fully functioning government responsive to the needs of the people, but the tools to understand and to improve it. And then finally, from Benjamin Franklin, who said at the end of the Constitutional Convention, "The governmental system is a republic if you can keep it." And then as my friend Elizabeth Motto, who is at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University, said, "In short, if we are going to keep this republic, we need to understand it. To understand it, we have to teach it." So with that, I will turn it over to Andy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Terry, for that. Just before turning it over to Andy, I just want to mention that At the bottom of your screen, we have a Q&A icon. Please use that to pose any questions. We don't have the chat enabled, but please feel free to pose questions at the bottom there. We'll reserve 10 minutes or so at the end of Andy's presentation for Q&A, and I look forward to a lively, spirited discussion after that. So thank you. So turning now to Andy. Thank you
Right.
again, Terry. That was wonderful.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Terry, for that. I'm Andy Tees. I'm with the Houston Community College in Houston, Texas. One of the great things about OER, which is sort of what panOpen works with, is that it frees you, I think, from the confines of a static text. Government is changing so quickly these days. It's good to be able to change what we do along with it. Not that you can't do that with a printed book, but it's good to have a tool like what we're working with panOpen on that can be modified as things change as you go through semesters or go from semester to semester without having to print a new book. So Terry and I and all of our co-authors are really excited about this project, and we hope that you'll take a look when we're done. My approach to this topic was to think about all the things that are going on in this kind of time of uncertainty and talk about some of the things that I think are interesting to discuss with students. I spent a lot of time teaching state government. As Terry mentioned, in Texas, we have a legislative requirement that to get any college degree, you have to have both a semester of federal government and a semester of state government, which is a wonderful full employment clause for teachers who teach government. It's nice to have 2 required classes at the community college level. It certainly keeps us hard at work, and we always like that. So a few of the things that I wanted to talk about from kind of a state perspective are the contrasts between the federal government and the states, and how those contrasts are kind of amplified in the time of uncertainty that we're in. I wanted to talk a little bit about the design of state government in Texas and how that contrasts to the federal government and how that kind of affects what's going on right now. I wanted to talk a little bit about federalism in the post-President Trump era, and then also just talk about partisanship and where we're heading as we study political parties with our students, and what the future of the major parties looks like, and how we think that future is going to be really different than it may have been a few years ago based on everything that's going on. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the design of state government in Texas. So January 12th here in Texas was opening day for our state legislature. Texas has a biennial legislature. We meet once every other year for 5 months, and then we take a year and a half off. And that's exactly how our founders wanted it. I think they figured the less the legislature was in town doing things, the better off we all were. That's kind of the cynical way to look at it. But nonetheless, that's what we have. We don't have a full-time year-round every year legislature the way that some states do and the way our Congress is set up. One thing that you immediately notice when you start looking at the legislature in Texas is that while Republicans currently hold a majority in both the House and the Senate, and every statewide elected office in Texas, the legislature really doesn't operate with that sort of winner-take-all system that you see in Congress and in some other states. In Texas, about a third of the Senate are made up of Democrats, about 2/3 are Republicans. And so when committee assignments came out, you will see that there was power sharing. The longest serving state senator in Texas is a guy named Jonathan Whitmire from Houston, who is a fairly progressive Democrat. He chairs the Criminal Justice Committee. There is a voting majority of Democrats on some committees, and you'll see even more of that in the House of Representatives when they name their committees probably next week or possibly the week after that. This power sharing arrangement is so different. If you ever watch C-SPAN, you'll see that it's really a winner-take-all system in Washington. Um, if the Democrats have a majority, which they currently do in both the House and the Senate, you'll see that every single committee is chaired by a Democrat. There's a voting majority of Democrats on every single committee, and subcommittees the same way. When hearings occur, you'll see that they're carefully scripted by the majority party to communicate a particular narrative. And that's not a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. Both parties take advantage of that power when they have a majority. In Texas, it's very different. One of the things that's really interesting to watch, it's going to be maybe a little different this year because of the pandemic, but anyone who has something to say about a bill can sign up and go say it to the House committee. And then again, if it gets that far in the Senate committee or vice versa, if it's a bill that started in the Senate. Committees will meet all night long and into the next morning if that's what's necessary for everybody to have their turn. And it's kind of an amazing, messy look at democracy, and very different from the way our federal government does it. But it lets everybody say their piece, and it doesn't really lend itself to people choosing up sides based solely on political party. The tone matters. When the House of Representatives elected its speaker, a guy named Dave Phelan, who's a brand new Speaker of the House this session, you saw nominating speeches from both Republicans and Democrats. And he was elected on one ballot with every single Democratic state representative and all of the Republicans but two voting in his favor, which is not something you would see in the sort of environment that we have in Washington today. So it's a very different way that the government is set up. However, anytime the year starts with a 1, that means the state legislature is having to do redistricting. They have to draw new districts for themselves, the House members and the state Senate members, and also for our members of Congress and also for our State Board of Education. That is maybe the most strictly, nakedly partisan thing that state legislators do. And it always has been, and it probably always will be. But short of that, it's just a very different approach that we take. And I think with my students, I find it important to point that out and to sort of contrast that. We'll watch the State House and the State Senate at work a little bit. They stream their meetings, and you can go back and look at recordings if your class time doesn't match up with something interesting that they're doing. Show a little bit of that while you also show a little bit from C-SPAN, and let students see how different it is. And I think that's one interesting thing to bring up during this sort of uncertain time, is that not everything is like they see in Washington, D.C. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about federalism. I think federalism for a lot of us is one of the harder things to teach. It's a concept that I have found my students know absolutely nothing about. They don't really talk about it in high school government or civics classes very much, or if they do, it's not anything that seems to stick with my students. But the relationship between the federal government and the states is something that's always a little bit hard, at least in my experience, for students to grasp. But this is a really interesting time to talk about federalism. So our new president was inaugurated on the 20th and immediately signed a bunch of executive orders. And if you start looking at some of the things that he did on his first day, it brings up some interesting ways to look at the concept of federalism. Right off the bat, this wasn't actually an executive order, but he arranged for the Centers for Disease Control to extend a blanket moratorium on residential evictions through the end of March. And you think, well, that makes sense. There's a public health crisis. It's not a good thing, even when we're not having one, when people get evicted from their apartments or their rent houses. But think of the federal government using its authority to basically abrogate millions of private contracts that were entered into willingly by private parties. It's really kind of an amazing thing. And this is not a Joe Biden thing. This started under President Trump back in September, I think it was. But it's kind of an interesting thing to talk about. in the context of federalism. Nowhere in Article 1 of the Constitution does it really seem to give the federal government the power to wipe out private contracts. The courts so far have said, well, none of those normal guardrails really seem to matter when you're in the midst of a public health crisis. We give the government extraordinary ability to go beyond their normal powers in order to, arrest a public health crisis. But as the vaccines proliferate, more people are protected, at least medically, from the health effects of this, but not necessarily for some time from the economics effects of this. It's going to be interesting to see how the federal government operates and how they work in relationship to the states. Coronavirus response, generally beyond just the eviction moratorium, is going to be an interesting way to look at federalism. Think about, federal mandates on travel, federal rules that govern what states can do with respect to travel and lockdowns, just the proliferation of the vaccine, the proliferation of CARES Act money, and how much of that is given to the states and what sort of constraints are put on that money. I think that's going to be a really interesting way to look at federalism with our students. The future of healthcare generally, even when we go beyond the pandemic. President Biden, let's not forget, was President Obama's vice president for 8 years. And I think we're going to see a resurgence of efforts to improve and kind of make permanent the Affordable Care Act, which is a really interesting study in federalism. The idea that the federal government can require people to buy insurance, or at least give a tax preference to people for buying insurance. The extent to which the federal government can federalize something which has been traditionally left to the states is going to be something really interesting, I think, to examine with our students. And then finally, election law changes. The Constitution goes to great pains to leave election rules mostly in the hands of the states. And yet, given everything that's gone on since November, there seems to be a lot that we need to think through in terms of where that relationship between the federal government and the states should rest with respect to elections. There are obvious federal implications to the way local governments operate elections. There are civil rights implications. And then just the whole idea of the legitimacy of the election. How much should the federal government do, or how much should it be able to do with respect to states having things like voter ID laws? The timing for no excuses early voting or for absentee voting. How long after an election should states be able to accept mail-in ballots from, within their state or from overseas, and still have that count in a federal election or in a local election? What does it do to the legitimacy of an election when election day comes and goes and we still don't know who won a national election for many days? And is that something that we can fix through the lens of federalism, or is it just one of those things? But I think these are going to be some really interesting areas to explore with students. And let's go to the next slide. And then finally, the future of partisanship. Imagine what the future of the Republican Party was going to look like when the nominee for president was Mitt Romney, or when the nominee for president was John McCain. And you sort of saw the typical traditional establishment Republican politicians kind of in line to take that on in future years. Donald Trump was the most non-traditional candidate that either party, I think, has ever nominated. And in the post-Trump era, it's going to be really interesting to see what the Republican Party does. And this impeachment trial, I think, is going to be sort of the opening salvo in this intra-party war within the Republicans as to what the future of the Republican Party is going to look like. I think this is something to look at nationally. I think it's something to look at within each state, was something certainly that we're going to look at within Texas. And certainly not to leave the Democrats alone. I think the Democrats face a really interesting future as well. Joe Biden ran as a candidate to unite everyone, which is wonderful if that's what you're into. There are elements in the Democratic Party that unity is the last thing that they want. There are groups on the left who are very uneasy with all of this talk of moderation and unity and civility. That's not what they're after. And we'll have to see how the new administration and how the Democratic Party generally is able to stretch its tent around both the Joe Biden, flavored moderates and the, AOCs and, Congresswoman Omar's of the world, and how they can sort of hold that coalition together as we look ahead to the 2022 midterm elections. And then finally, the notion of governing with a 50-50 United States Senate, at least for now, with a vice president, obviously from one party there to break the tie. What is that going to look like? How are committees going to function? How difficult is it going to be for the new majority leader to know that any single one member of his party can hold him hostage on 51 to 50 vice president tiebreaker votes? We've seen that once before in recent memory, and I don't think the Republican Party enjoyed it very much at all. So that's going to be another way when we study political parties to sort of talk about this time of uncertainty and sort of what it holds for the future of government. So going to the next slide. I just had a couple of quotes here as we talk about the future of parties. This is from the lieutenant governor in Texas, a guy named Dan Patrick. He used to be a sportscaster in Houston before he bought a radio station, became a political talk show host, and then later went on to serve in the state Senate as lieutenant governor. He says the party is really built around Donald Trump, the brand, the image, and most importantly, his policies and what he accomplished. Whoever runs in 2024, if they walk away from Trump and his policies, I don't think they can get through a primary. At the same time, if you go to the next slide, this is a quote from Will Hurd, who's a sort of a moderate Republican former congressman from Texas, who says the future of the Republican Party is being the folks that empower people, not the government that is focused on helping everyone move up the economic ladder. It's a party filled with leaders that inspire, not fearmonger. One of the things that I learned during my time as an undercover officer in the CIA, which was his background, is you should be fighting the next war, not the last war. We should be looking to the future. So some very different views of what the future of one of the two major parties is going to look like. So those are just a few things that I wanted to key in on as we teach in this time of uncertainty. There's no end to the fascinating things that we can talk about, watching the news break around us and trying to make sure that we cover that in our classroom in a way that makes this, academic subject into something that our students can see really affects them in their day-to-day lives. So Brian, thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you, Andy. Wonderful presentation as well. So we'd like to reserve the balance of the time. There's our respective contact information. And if you have any questions for any of us, part of this, I'm happy to respond. So we do have some questions, and I'll turn to those now. Again, please use the Q&A at the bottom there for any additional questions as they come up, and we'll try to address them. So one question to Terry is, do you recommend any online sources that can help students learn to recognize false information and bogus social media? I think that's a great question. So timely. So
well, it is a good question. There's a couple of things that's going on through our association, APSA. There is a sub-branch that they opened this last year that's ABSA Educate, and there's a huge number of resources that are posted there. What I have done during probably this last year, I've just been collecting articles and source information. We're fortunate on our campus. The other thing that happened during the summer is that we opened a teaching and learning academy here at Midland College. And so we are in the process of collecting these resources and putting them in some type of collective fashion there. And I'm thrilled about it because most of us have been struggling with not only that issue, but with a number of issues, trying to do it entirely on our own. And so I love the fact that we're creating these, spots, so to speak, where we can go and access it. I would be happy to share. You've got my contact information. If you want to send me an email, I'll be happy to share all that I have collected so far, as far as weeding out the truth. But I will say that right after the election in November, and we at Midland College, we have some face-to-face classes, and we're online as well. But, I had a student who came in right after the election, and, I threw it out there. I said, what do you think? What do you think about the election? And I knew I had this one student who was very pro-Trump, and he said, well, the election was stolen, and I said, okay, well, tell me why you think that. And pretty much it was, well, I read it on Twitter. And I said, well, what instance? And he started talking about the number of people who were registered in Wisconsin, and the number of people who actually voted was far greater than that. And I said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to the Secretary of State's office in the state of Wisconsin. And of course, what you find is that the information that had been put out there was outdated information. So trying to help them figure out a way to go directly to the source, I think, is key. But yeah, I've come up with some pretty good articles. So like I said, send me an email. I'd be happy to share it with you.
Great. All right. Thank you. All right. Another question is, I also teach, this one is for Andy. I also teach state and local government, so I'm finding the discussion on Texas very interesting, despite the fact that I'm in Georgia. Do you see this every other year type of legislature very effective in governing in the second largest state in the union? How are Texas legislative needs so much less than the largest state, which I believe does have a full-time legislature? Another great question.
Yeah, Stacy, that's a great question. There's advantages and there's disadvantages to our approach. Some of the original logic of it still holds. The idea that we really didn't want a full-time legislature running things. We wanted a group of citizens to gather together, pass a budget, make whatever changes in the law need to be made, and then go home. And we still have that to a large extent. We don't pay our legislators very much in Texas. No one has state legislator as their job because you can't earn a living doing it. We pay $600 a month whether you need it or not. The biggest problem, I think, with the biennial legislature is the budget. When you think about writing a 2-year budget for a state with $100 billion a year budget, in Texas, as I'm sure is the case in Georgia, we're required under our Constitution to have a budget that balances. And by balanced, it means that our state controller, we have like a separately elected independent chief financial officer for the state. Controller has to certify that the budget doesn't spend any more than he and his economists think the state's going to bring in taxes during that 2-year period. Well, in a state like Texas, trying to estimate what revenues are going to be 3 years in advance, which is what you would have to do with a 2-year budget because you pass it during the session in the spring and then it takes effect in the fall and then runs for 2 years beyond that. How many people on the webinar today can tell me what the price of oil, West Texas Intermediate crude, is going to be in the summer of 2023? Anybody? I can't. The economists in our state controller's office can make a guess. And it's a good guess. It's an educated guess, but it's just a guess. And so it is a challenge trying to sort of plot the financial course of the state that far in advance, because so many things can change. When they wrote the last budget, who knew that a big portion of the economy was going to shut down in 2020 because of the pandemic? That's not something you can forecast very well. So long answer, but there's advantages and there's disadvantages to doing it that way.
Right. Do you have a question? Could you walk us through the redistricting process?
Oh man, I can try. Was that for me or Terry?
I think that's open to either of you. Yeah. Not
well,
specified.
I'll start. The first step, and this is what makes it really hard this time, is the legislature has to receive census information from the federal government, and that's the starting point that it uses to start drawing districts. You can't draw the districts until you get the population figures, for each census tract, so how many of them go in each district. Well, it looks like Texas is not going to get. I shouldn't just say Texas. It looks like the states are not going to get demographic census information until April, at the earliest, maybe May. And if that's the case, it's going to be really difficult for our legislature to go from 0 to 4 full-blown redistricting maps in just a few weeks. There's a lot of thought that this is all going to get punted to a special session of the legislature, which is something that governors in Texas can call in between regular sessions. In Texas, if the legislature is unable to agree on maps, then it goes to a redistricting commission, which the Constitution sets up, which consists of, I think, 4 of the statewide office holders plus the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and the 5 of them do it. If they can't do it, it would go to the courts. So that's just a kind of a quick spin through the process.
Mm-hmm. Terry, anything to add to that?
I think the only thing there in Texas, when you compare across state lines, it is the state legislature that initially draws those lines, which means that without a doubt, you're going to see some gerrymandering from a partisanship basis. The Republicans are always going to say, well, we should redraw the lines to favor Republicans because we have more Republicans. And certainly that's an argument to be made. But there's, reform efforts through the year as maybe we need a bipartisan or a nonpartisan committee to redraw those lines.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So we do have other questions coming in. I just before we get to those, I actually wanted to pose one, throw out to both of you. I was really interested by this, the point that you made, distinguishing, Andy, the difference between the federal government legislative practice of winner take all and the Texas government practice of power sharing when it comes to committees. So while I understand that the power dynamics are different, the question that I have is, how does it affect legislative outcomes? Can you point to sort of concrete examples where you would have outcomes in the Texas legislature that would really be hard to fathom in the winner take all model of a Washington power relationship?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm racking my brain trying to think of specific examples, and I'm sure I'll think of one like right after the webinar is over.
Okay.
Well, I think if you could use Symphonia Thompson.
We can always continue this conversation later, but I was just thinking about that question as you were talking.
Terry, talk about Chairman Thompson.
Well, she's an African American member who's the longest standing. The seniority really counts in Texas. I mean, I think that we are becoming more partisan as a legislature. But I think also if you look at the history of Texas, where we were, for 100 years, we were a solid Democratic state. And then for about 20 years, we saw some two-party competition. But for the last 30 years, we have been pretty solidly Republican. But I think only until recently, if you look at that ideological line, we were very conservative Democrats. And when we moved to the Republican Party, we were still just right there along the line. Now, as Andy mentioned, that divide between the Republican Party, the moderate and the very conservative ones, has gotten bigger. And that's a much bigger divide than that initial, where we went from being very conservative Democrats to very moderate Republicans. But Senfronia Thompson, who's been down there, she's from the Houston area, and she still chairs committees, and she carries a great deal of weight. People respect her a great deal because of her experience in the legislature. And she has been able to pass through particularly legislation that deals with the minority community, healthcare rights, and things like that. So I think there's been a little bit more sharing of power, certainly, than you would have seen, in Congress right now.
Mhm.
And Andy, you mentioned John Whitmire. I mean, I think same thing over in the Senate.
Yeah, those are some great examples of the people. I'm trying to think of specific policy outcomes, and I'm still thinking, but because a lot of the policy that they do isn't strictly Republican or Democratic, but they do set bills for hearings. You see this all the time. A Republican committee chair will set a bill for hearing that he or she doesn't favor, as a courtesy to the member. And they may vote against it, but they don't just flat out block things as often. It's not that they never do that, but it's not quite the same just sort of automatic outcome that you see at the federal level.
Great. So a couple more questions. Again, throwing it out to either. Would you discuss some of the most challenging problems local and state government in Texas have faced during the 2021 pandemic? Do you see an attempt by the Texas legislature to update or rewrite the outdated Constitution in the future? All attempts thus far have failed, right? Also, would it be possible to access, oh, that was a question, wanting a recording of in the near future. Okay, so yeah, we are recording this, and we will make this available to all who would like that. But actually, Terry, Andy, to these questions.
Short answer on number 2 is no. We probably will not rewrite. All of the attempts have been pretty much dismal failures. The pandemic, I think and I think we say this in just about everything, lack of information. I mean, coming from the federal level to the state level, from the state level down to the local levels. I mean, I don't think any city knows at any given time how many doses they're going to get. And I think that becomes problematic. But Andy, you're down there in Houston. It's a lot easier, perhaps here in Midland, where I've got 175,000 people. You're looking at a totally different situation down there in Houston.
Yeah, I agree with Terry, first of all, on the Constitution. I don't think we're going to do major constitutional revision anytime soon. And you're right, the last time they tried to do that through a constitutional convention was in the 1970s, and it did not end well. They did, to their credit, they did a complete non-substantive revision of the Constitution in the 90s. It didn't get a lot of press, and we just did it as a constitutional amendment that people voted on at the ballot box, but they took out a lot of the anachronistic stuff, which as a teacher, I kind of hated to see, because that made it fun to teach, the part about how the governor could call out the militia to repel Indian attacks, and I mean, they took that out of the Constitution, which is probably for the best. But it was sort of fun to teach. There used to be a deal where I think it was the sergeant at arms of the Senate had to issue a permit if you were going to drive swine across the Capitol grounds. They took that out. So they have improved it a little bit. It's still very long. It's still very laborious. On the problems faced during the pandemic, there have been a lot of bills filed so far to change what the governor can do without the legislature in between sessions in terms of emergency proclamations. A lot of the legislators were a little miffed that he did not call them into special session to, take a piece of the action, I guess, during the pandemic. And so there are a bunch of bills to rein in the power of the governor to do certain things, during a disaster declaration. We'll see how that goes.
Okay, so we just want to take a couple closing questions. We just have a couple minutes left, so we can just address these questions briefly. Do you have any group activities to teach the Texas Constitution? Um, any group activities for teaching the Texas Constitution?
I do one just on allowing students to take a look at the process of amendment for them in a group situation to figure out, after we've kind of talked about the Texas Constitution and the 500 amendments plus, what is one that they would suggest? And I kind of give them some prompts and stuff to go through and allow them to do it in a group setting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Andy, any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm one of those people that doesn't like group work. I hated it when I was a student, so I try to avoid group work, especially
and I use it every day.
I know not everybody feels the same way, and I know that that's kind of cool. It's kind of chic right now. I have some assignments that I really like to do on the state constitution. A lot of times, especially now when the legislature is actually meeting, I like to pick out what I think are some interesting joint resolutions. That's how a constitutional amendment gets proposed in Texas, and have the students delve into it. This is one, Terry, you might enjoy. They have another, and I think that they're going to make a more concentrated effort this time, a constitutional amendment to have Texas opt out of daylight savings time.
Yeah.
Which I think Midland, you're in Central Time, right? But out in El Paso, they're in Mountain Time.
El Paso's the only one that's in Mountain Time. All the rest of us are in Central.
Yeah. I have mixed feelings on that, but it seems like that's one thing that perhaps could unite us as a society. Some people feel differently about social justice issues and, Republican and Democrat, or gambling or drinking or whatever, but everybody seems to hate daylight savings time. So maybe that's the one thing that can bring us all together as a state.
So we have more questions than we have time for now, but just in the last minute or so, I think this could be a really good closing question for you all, and that is how. But at the same time, it's a big question, so it take a long time to answer fully. How do you overcome both student apathy and antipathy regarding government and civic engagement? So yeah, big question.
Well, I guess saying
first you want me to.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Terry.
I think for me, just engaging the students. Again, I begin every class period with what's the most prominent current event, trying to make government real to them, to make them understand that government does affect them, whether they think it's going to be somewhere off in the future, by going through these current events, to make them realize the importance of some of them, and trying to tie it into an everyday event in their life, I think will help with the apathy. The antipathy, right now, I don't think that it's just from students. I think it's from the general population. We've got a lot we'll have to overcome there.
One thing that I always like to do to kick off a semester, and it works better in the classroom than it does virtually, but I like to, as we're going through and meeting each other, the students and I always ask people what they're majoring in and what they're going to do for a living. And I try to turn that into kind of a money discussion where I'll pull some poor student, up to the front and say, okay, what are you going to do for a living? How much money do you think you're going to earn? And then we go through and say, okay, well, over the course, if you start your job this year and work for the next 40, this is how much money you think you'll earn over the course of your career. And then, we write that up on the chalkboard and say, how much of that are you going to pay in taxes? And nobody, of course, has any idea, but you can go through the tables. And when you're all in, state, local, federal, it works out to about 25, 26% of your income at most tax brackets, unless it's really high or really low. And so for somebody that's going to make $3 million over the course of their career, we talk about, the percentage of that that's going to go to the government, $750,000, more than they're going to spend on their house, more than they're going to spend on every car that they ever own. So if you're making this size investment in your system of government, don't you have a responsibility to yourself, even if you're not looking at it altruistically, to kind of manage your investment? And I like to kind of bring it into them as kind of a financial thing, but you look at government class as kind of an owner's manual. And that tends to bring in some people that otherwise were looking at it as just kind of an exercise to, check a box so they can get on with their, pharmacy career or whatever.
Okay, afraid we're gonna have to leave it there. That was we're past the hour mark already. So thank you both, Andy, Terry. Really appreciate these presentations. We are recording this, and it can make the recording available upon request. And just to note as well that next Wednesday at noon Central Time will be, so that's February 3rd at noon. We will have the second part of this government series, teaching government in a time of uncertainty, and that's with also faculty who are part of our OER project. So more on that as well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and well, stay safe.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Take care.